Okay.
But I was reading something the other day that the sort of our genetic engineering of our cattle has gotten so precise. And so, I mean, I was thinking about this because of the COVID thing happening right now and how susceptible we are to certain strains. My understanding of our precision in the sort of the genetic engineering of cattle and sort of the strains of cattle are out there are really so tight that we have a significant vulnerability to sort of just some genetic defect. Is there something to that? Is that accurate? What is, I mean, how did that happen, I guess? And what is
so dairy cattle, we're talking about two things. Dairy cattle, the genetic, the genome is so tight, it's probably a dozen sires at most have raised every dairy cow in the country.
I mean, just 12 animals. Everything's descended from 12 animals.
Yep. Turkeys, last I checked, it was 2.
Wow.
Hogs is very tight. So you're exact. I was thinking about this today. You know, genetics are wonderful and things we can learn and improving efficiency and predictability and a lot of production traits. But Mother Nature really hates anything that lacks diversity, and she will eventually punish you for it. So in the cattle business, fortunately, they mapped the entire bovine genome, I think a couple of years before the human. So 2008, 2009, somewhere in there. Maybe, no, it was earlier. It was before my daughter was born. 2002, I think. So we're able to put out markers to look for different things, but a marker doesn't predict a virus that we don't know anything about. So yes, going back, I guess whether it's our landscape, whether it's our communities, whether it's our businesses, we have to learn to embrace diversity because that's what will protect us in the long run. That's what I've learned in agriculture, is that let Mother Nature lead and roll with some of those things instead of trying to control it. And, you know, one of the things we've learned, I'm going to drift away from the livestock because it's really scary how concentrated we've come with our genetics. But something we've tried to do with our pastures or with our crops is, you know, there's no diversity in a cornfield. There's no diversity in a pasture because we spray and we use different things. So the only thing on that acre might be a monoculture of a certain grass or a monoculture of corn or a monoculture of soy. So there are no beneficials to combat nature will win, and she'll put out beneficial pests. She'll put out beneficial plants, things like that can conquer it. And we turn around and kill them and then try to just get more powerful stuff to deal with it again. And that goes back to why I really want to mess with that concept of a research farm, of seeing, I want some colossal failures on this thing. You know, I want to build a farm that if I'm not failing 50% of the time, I've let you down, because that's where our greatest progress comes from.
How big, I mean, when you're talking about putting that together, I mean, how big does it need to be? What does it take? I mean, what would it really take to get that done? I mean, is it like a private Iowa state? Is it like Iowa Conservancy, but with a broader purpose? And how do you do it?
Well, Make Perfect goes back to, you know, pointing fingers is the sign of a failing system. So I think instead of pointing fingers, it's, you know, for me, some people would say, well, do it and leave the university out. And I'm saying, no, you know, I want to utilize all those great resources. So one simple way you could start, you know, the university's land is all across Iowa. They're the third largest landowner in the state.
Did you say 14,000 acres is just owned by Iowa State, and that's spread out all across the state?
They actually have about 16,000, but 2,000 of that is the research farm and the campus and the golf course. And then another 14,000 throughout the whole country, throughout the whole state of Iowa. And, you know, mine is one of since, let's step back and say, you know, corn and soy are important. The way you're farming is important. We've had great efficiency, but if you're a research institution, let's do a very simple experiment. On every farm you have, half of it's going to be straight on conventional, and the other half is going to be a variety of forward-thinking regenerative practices until we find the one that works best for where we're at. And, you know, I even suggested, because we've become so dependent on finite resources, model it based on the price of a barrel of crude oil. So this is our $50 a barrel crude oil farm. This is our $100 a barrel crude oil farm. This is our $200 a barrel farm. So that you have a model that prepares us as we do start to deplete our reserves. You know, whether we're at peak oil or not, I don't know. I suspect we are. And I know that the oil we've got to extract costs more and more through fracking and tar sands and things like that. So let's start to research agriculture in a way that moves us away from our dependency so that we're ready to, you know, so we're ready to make sure we're leaving a legacy of resources, of abundance of resources instead of scarcity. Scarcity creates conflict. And when we have an abundance of things, that creates opportunity. And we're sitting in this Goldilocks era where we live right now that we actually can do that. And I don't think 100 years from now, people have the luxury of saying that when they talk about research.
I mean, it'll be interesting, right? I mean, we've now got, you know, 1 out of 5 people are having to essentially rethink their entire economic model personally.
Mm-hmm.
You've got, you know, one would wonder when retail was under threat before, what happens now that we're almost putting a death nail in it, right? Yep. Agricultural, interestingly, I mean, you know, it seems like our biggest failures recently have been our inflexibility in supply chain adjustment. It would be interesting to see, I mean, if we really were going to say, you know what, this is what perfect agriculture looks like. Mm-hmm. What do you think it looks like? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about, you know, the butcher situation, right? Instead of going to these big centralized processing plants, maybe this gives us a chance to, you know, revive the historic's the wrong word, because it's not like you're, you know, 160 years old. I mean, like, you're growing up with these, right? I mean, what?
Right, but maybe this might be a chance for us to look back and say, you know, I'll use the example when I started farming full time in the early 90s. Walmart had gotten into the supermarket business. And one of the things they did was recognize that the butchers had a union, and that does not fit their business model. So they turned to the packing plant saying, deliver us single serving sizes of meat so we don't have to have butchers at our supermarkets. And, you know, at the time that probably looked really good to their shareholders. It probably looked great on paper. But when we look at what we're dealing with right now, that paved the way for the larger scale packing plants that we have. It paved the way for more concentration in the industry. And what I look at right now is, what if we still had more meat cutters and butchers at all our grocery stores? Now, we'd have to do things differently. We'd have to have several more smaller scale packing plants, and we call it break it down, where we take the animal and we break it down to 1/2 or 1/4, and then it goes to the grocery store where the butcher then cuts you exactly what you want, which is also kind of neat for, you know, for the consumer. I'd like this cutter, I'd like that. It's an essential trade that we let go, and this goes back to my concept on modeling. I think when we talk about agriculture, you know, Iowa State University, within that institution, there's 56 or 57 different colleges, you know, for everything from an English major to engineering to, you know, biomedical to agriculture. But when you think about our food system, every one of those colleges has something to contribute to how we feed ourselves sustainably. So I guess my vision would be, it might surprise people, but that farm might rely more on someone in communications or engineering than it would on someone in agronomy sometimes. You know, everyone's important in this system, and I guess that's what we're seeing so much right now too when we look at what's happening in our packing plants. I go back to, as a society, we've got to start recognizing and taking care of those that we have taken for granted for so long. And whether that's someone that has risked their life to come to this country to work in a packing plant to do a job no one else here wanted to do. You know, I've watched this argument, and maybe I'm getting off track, but I've watched this argument of saying that role of citizenship is saying, let's make sure that someone's job is safe. You know, if this is an essential job, 6 months ago, we passed legislation that reduced the rules on USDA inspection on our packing plants so they could speed up the chains, so they could have more people on the floor. You know, where was the humanity to sit down and say, you know what, it's really essential that we eat, and we eat healthy food, and we have a good system in place? Where was the humanity that made sure that that worker was protected and we knew how valuable they were to us? We looked at them as a disposable person, and that's not the country I want to see coming out of this. I want to see one that makes sure that they are important. At the same time, you know, we have people advocating just shut them all down. Well, you know, that person didn't risk their life to come here and not have a job, but let's make sure their job's as safe as it can be. There's a middle ground in that.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see in recent years the mirrors we have been able to look at on our society has been very illuminating. I mean, I think this crisis here with essential workers is a really intriguing one, because, you know, putting people into desperation that are essential is only viable if they are fundamentally replaceable, if they are expendable. If you know I've got another 80 of them that I can turn the spigot on with, I can get rid of 80. I mean, that is, it's an intriguing, and almost, you know, cynically speaking, a resource waste issue, right? I mean, to say this person has
it's human, and it's tragic. And it goes back to that same thing. It's like, how did we get to a situation with all the wonderful things we have right now in our life, you know, in modern times? How in the world can we tolerate that?
Well,
I don't know. I mean,
it makes you wonder how many people actually have what they think they have. I think is also interesting. I mean, I think there's far more people who are. What's been interesting is when we started missing a few payments, right? You look at mid-sized real estate owners and things, you know, where if all of a sudden the rent is now being delayed until August, yet that property is now in negotiations with someone upstream. Those who looked stable are now close to homeless. Now, their fall is greater because you're falling from a $500,000 home to none, but they're still as close to none as anyone who's making 30 in some cases, which that part I hope is illuminating enough for people to rethink the footing we should all be on. But there's another piece in there that I thought was really, really interesting that you're talking about. Not to go from something super serious to one that's actually just a different piece, is your point on Iowa State and all the individuals that could be pulled into it. It's almost like what you're advocating isn't, because you were identifying, we have this majors model where we got engineers, we got communications, we got this, but we don't really have an industry track model, right? I mean, there isn't really, like, if I'm an aerospace engineer, I'm in my silo within engineering, but I'm also not connected to astrophysics, right? So, I mean, when we look at, aerospace, my last understanding of Iowa State is it's the third largest aerospace college in the country. They send more engineers to Boeing than anyone else. I mean, we've had, 3 Boeing CEOs out of Iowa State, if I'm remembering correctly, right? Yet, number one, we don't know any, most of us don't know anything about it. I mean, I think when I moved to Houston, I watched more Iowa State games in Houston because so many guys at Mass were from Iowa State. It's either that, and I'm sure not going to watch a Texas A&M game with anyone. That just gets weird. But it's interesting. You identify almost, it's like rethinking the institution along an industry track where people can plug into the industry track regardless of the major. So it's don't want to use cross-pollination as almost a pun, but it's almost like, is that what you're envisioning, or how would you do that?
Well, I mean, our advances have been about disruption. I like to call it leverage points, but when you look at all the different pieces that fit into a given system, it can be a very small leverage point that makes all the difference between success and failure, or sustainability and failure, whatever you want to use. And that's where I worry when I look at this. I'm like, man, I didn't go to college, so I maybe I'll look at it differently. But it's like, I'd love to go and I want to learn a little bit about that, and I want to make sure I know that person, and I want to make sure I know who to ask. And what I see instead is this: people come out and they've graduated and they've got their, they in whatever discipline they're in, they're started out, and there's almost an insecurity to ask questions. They want to kind of prove themselves. There's kind of some posturing to prove themselves. Growing up, my dad every day would say, boy, you don't know shit till you're 30. And finally, I was 30 years old and I realized I didn't know shit, but that was okay. I'd sit back and I'd study a problem and I'd ask questions and I'd figure the whole thing out. I'd really take an objective view to it, and it served me really well. And I didn't like hearing it for the first 29 and a half years, but man, maybe there's a nicer way to say it, but it was actually really, really good advice. And to tap into all those different, if you're the brightest person in the world, but you have no communication skills, are you really good to me? Or if I'm not able to tap into your talent because I can't figure out how to communicate with you or understand you, there's a psychology element, then I've screwed up my business because I didn't have enough acumen to go in and work with this really talented individual. You can look at it both ways. So some of these soft skills that people make fun of sometimes are really important. I mean, I think about in agriculture, animal science was what I would have pursued if I would have gotten a degree. And I've realized that animal science only has to do with about 5 or 10% of what I do on a daily basis. There's a lot of psychology that when I go to a sale to buy cattle, there's this dominance of the sale ring, and you've got to figure out the whole vibe and what's going on and who you have to bid against and who you have to wear down and how you have to work. So you've got that dynamic, or you have, figuring out finance, figuring out all these different things that wear on you. A liberal arts education would probably serve people better for agriculture than a straight up ag degree, from what I've seen, my experience at 51 years old.
Something to that was I was talking to someone the other day, and they were identifying that a lot of people want to be marine biologists, right? To which I thought, oh, that'd be sort of interesting. I mean, and they said, well, there's just no jobs. And I thought, well, we're now farm raising fish. We got tilapia everywhere. It seems like that's where it should be. And they're like, no, they think they want to go search for whales or work in a zoo or something like that, right?
Plastic out of the oceans.
Well, that wouldn't be that wouldn't be an unnecessary role right now.
No.
I mean, it is interesting to think about within the agricultural context as well, right? How much agricultural science is there versus operations and production? And, would we farm the same if we had access to collectively think slightly differently?
That's a great way of saying that. To help us think differently and have that, to be seekers of the truth, that we talk about that a lot with my peers in agriculture that try to work together on that. And it's just to be a seeker of the truth. It involves going far beyond what we thought we were supposed to study.
Well, with that, we will leave that as our. I know we're over our target time. However, Seth, thank you very much for being the guinea pig on this quest for innovation in the face of unintended consequences. And hopefully, someone else will step up and be number 2. So I'll get this processed, get it out, and hopefully, a few more people don't have to wonder, who is that?
Awesome. Thank you for doing all of this.
Hey, thanks, man. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you. Have a good night.
See ya.